All right. We'll say good morning to everyone joining us online. Happy New Year to everybody who is joining us. Hope that you have all had a great start to the new year so far. Hopefully, over this past week, you've been feeling that excitement that comes with a new year. All the new things to come, all the new things that we get to look forward to. So I hope that you've been feeling that as we start 2026. Maybe you're someone who has been planning ahead. Maybe you've got a new fancy calendar you got for Christmas and you're putting everything in there and you're planning ahead, looking forward to all the different things that you want to do this year. Maybe you've been, maybe if you don't write it down, then you've just been mentally planning and preparing of how you would like to see this year go. So if you're someone who thinks ahead and you're kind of looking forward to what this year could bring, if you haven't already, I would highly encourage you to listen to the message that we heard last week, because I just want to remind you all that as we go into this new year, before we get too far, we need to stop just for a moment and we need to pray. And let's ask God to take the lead for us this year. Let's make sure that we're giving him the first portion of our time and not just the scraps that we have left over. It's easy to give God our scraps. We give him the last 5 minutes that we have before bed when our eyes are heavy, and maybe when you do that, it's right before bed, you're so tired that maybe your prayer doesn't even make sense. I say sometimes in those moments, thank God that we have the Holy Spirit to kind of speak on our behalf, because, man, sometimes when you're sleepy, your prayers might seem a little jumbled. Thank God that we have that Spirit. Maybe sometimes we just give him our leftover money that we have. At the end of the month, after everything that we have bought that we want, we just give him whatever that we have left over. This year in 2026, I want us to change this. I want to make sure that this year we are giving him our first fruits, the first portion of everything that we have. Because when you give God the first portion of everything, and you pray to let him know that you want him to take the lead, and you let him know that you're ready to be used by him in whatever way he has planned for you, you may be very surprised at where he takes you. This is going to be my focus for all of 2026, and I pray that this would be yours as well. Let's let God take the lead this year, and let's see where he takes us. So with all that being said, since we are in a new year, I've been doing a lot of praying and asking God, where do you want us to be this year? Where do you want us to go with the messages that we're going to hear? Because, right now we're not in the middle of a series. We finished everything up that we had last year. So we get a fresh start. So as I've been praying, as I've been kind of looking over it over the past couple of weeks, I've been feeling a tug to go back to the Old Testament. It's something that could be a little bit intimidating for some, especially when you go back and reread it. But, I'm really looking forward to it. So as I was looking over Old Testament books, I was kind of rereading them and seeing kind of what the themes of a lot of them were. The one that really stood out the most, and it's the one that we're going to be covering over the next couple of months, is the book of Joshua. Now, if you've never read the book of Joshua, or maybe it's been a long time since the last time that you read it, what we're going to see as we cover this is that it's more than just a history lesson. This is a story about a people. It's the Israelites as they are preparing to enter into a new season of life. Right before this book takes place, the Israelites have been wandering through the desert for 40 years. They faced a whole lot of uncertainty that time because, they had been following God's lead. But through it all, They were able to see firsthand how God has been providing for them along the way. And during that time, there are some miraculous things that have happened. So after wandering the desert and after learning some lessons the hard way, which is a short and sweet way of wording it, and for those that maybe have read this whole story before, you know what period of time that we're talking about, then you know what I mean by some hard lessons that had to be learned. God had prepared the hearts of the next generation so they could be ready for what he had in store for them. They were right on the edge of walking into the promised land. They had never been there. They didn't know what the path ahead of them looked like, but they were letting God take the lead, and they were following him with faith. And when I read over this book, and it just reminded me so much of us. We're like the Israelites right now. We're on the edge of a new season. It's a new year, new beginnings that we have. We're looking forward to a fresh start. And we're looking forward to the things that God has in store for us. And we don't know what the road ahead of us looks like. We may face some battles. We may have some giants waiting before us, just like how the Israelites did in this book. But we have to trust him with everything that we've got. And we're going to follow him wherever it is that he takes us. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to start right at the beginning of this book. So if you would, please turn with me to Joshua chapter 1. And I already gave a little bit of the context about, where we are starting. If you're someone that really wants to catch up and, kind of learn and follow through with where we're at, you could read the first portion of this book. There's only a couple of books ahead of it. So if you want to kind of speed read that to catch yourself up, you're more than welcome to do so. So this is right after the desert and right before the promised land. So if you have your Bibles open, please read with me Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. It says, "Now after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spake unto Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' minister, saying, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, thou and all this people, unto the land which I do give to them, even to the children of Israel." This is all we're going to cover today because there is so much that is packed into these verses that we really need to give it the time. As we go through this book, I want to make sure that we're not rushing through it because there is so much for us to learn. So we're going to take our time with it. Right here in verse 1, it begins with, "Now after the death of Moses." And this is a line that we can't rush past because these words, they carry so much weight to them. If you go back and you read the books that lead up to Joshua, it leads you up to this point in history that we're talking about, you'll realize pretty quickly just how much of Israel's story is tied to Moses. His influence is everywhere. Their understanding of God, their freedom, even how they worship, all of it was shaped by the leadership of this one man. Moses wasn't just a leader. For Israel, he was the leader. They followed him for most of their lives. He was the man that God had used to bring them out of slavery in Egypt. He was the one who stood before Pharaoh and over again had to use the phrase, "Thus saith the Lord." He was the one God had used to send the plagues upon Egypt. He was the one who God had used to establish the Passover, which not only brought deliverance at this point in time, but it also foreshadowed and pointed towards ahead to something much greater. When Israel was fleeing from Egypt and they were trapped between Pharaoh's army and the sea, it was Moses who lifted his staff and God parted the Red Sea, allowing them to walk through on dry ground. Now imagine how that would have been. All of these stories that you think about, which is just amazing to see. Think about everything that Moses had went through. Think about all the influence and how God had used him. But this story in particular, when Moses split the Red Sea and they walked through on dry ground, the sea literally split. There were walls of water beside them, and they walked through on dry ground. In that moment, imagine all of maybe the fear that they were feeling and just the overall just awe of the moment as they were able to see just how amazing this is. And Moses, he was the face of this miracle because God had used him to make this happen. And when they were traveling through the desert, they were unsure of what was next. It was Moses who they looked towards for direction. When they were hungry, God used Moses to provide manna from heaven. When they were thirsty, God used Moses to bring water out of the rock. Moses was the one who met with God on Mount Sinai, and he received the law. And this is actually, one of my personal favorite stories, in case you've never heard it before. Moses came down from the mountain, and he had spent so much time in God's presence that his face was literally shining. He had spent over 40 days in the presence of God, and that glory was radiating off of him. And when he came down, it was so noticeable that it scared the Israelites. Moses ended up having to put a veil over his face to hide it because it scared them so much. Can you imagine being in the presence of God and his glory is literally radiating off of you? This is one of my favorite stories to read. I think it's, a really, really cool story. And if you haven't read it, it's in Exodus chapter 34 down towards the end. So if you have a chance, I'd give it that one a read. And then to mention the tough lessons that I had mentioned earlier. When Israel failed, as they did over and over again, when they complained or they rebelled or when they turned their hearts away, it was Moses who stood between them and God. He prayed for them. He pleaded on their behalf. He interceded for them. Many times, Moses had to bear the weight of a stubborn and disobedient people. And yet he continued to lead them forward. This was a man they trusted. He was the voice that they followed, and he was the leader that God had used for decades. So when this book begins with, now after the death of Moses, this isn't something that we can just skip over like it's some background information. This is the end of an era. This is the closing of a chapter that literally shaped Israel's identity. And it's so important that we just stop here for just a moment to really feel the weight that these words carry. Because for them in this moment, all they had ever known was Moses' leadership. And now he's gone. For them, this moment would have been filled with so much uncertainty. If you read the chapters, if you read the books before this, and you see how the Israelites always came to Moses with all the different questions that they have, you can just imagine the questions that they would have now. They'd be feeling, well, who's going to lead us now? What is going to happen next? And this is why, what's said next is also so important. Because it says that the Lord spake unto Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' minister. When Moses died, God did not become silent. God did not abandon his people after this. Instead, God spoke very clearly. It says that he spoke to Joshua. And another thing that you'll notice is how Joshua is described. It says that he is Moses' minister. Joshua didn't just appear out of nowhere and say, all right, now I'm here. I'm, going to be your leader now. He is someone who has been with them ever since they left Egypt. He had known what it was like to be a slave. He knew what it felt like to be someone who was freed under the leadership of Moses. He had been there with his people throughout the entire journey. And during that time, he had been serving right alongside Moses. He watched all these different events take place, all the ones that we just mentioned, and there is countless others that weren't mentioned in that short list that I gave. That's why I'd say I'd highly encourage, if you're someone, to go back and reread those. If you've never, I think it's a great read to have. He watched all of these wonderful things happen. He's seen, how God was using Moses to do all of this. For a second, you have to stop and think, what about Joshua's, shadow years, called it? For 40 years, he was the guy behind the scenes. He was, pretty much the assistant to Moses. He was the one setting up the tent while Moses was off and talking to God. Joshua was faithful in small, quiet, seemingly boring tasks. That is what he was trusted with, and that is what he was faithful in. But now, after Moses' passing, God calls on him. It's not because he's replacing Moses. He's not called to just be the replacement. But it's because God's work is continuing on. Even though the leadership has changed, God has not. The promise that God gave to his people before is no different just because Moses is gone. And in fact, if you go back and you read this, you'll see that God's mission would not be continued until Moses' work was finished. God had told Moses that he would not enter into the promised land, and he didn't. He led them all the way to the edge of where God promised. And now it's time for the next chapter. So now when you look through, we covered all of verse 1 in this moment. And I'll tell you, there is so much that is packed into these verses. This is why we really need to stop and take our time for it. But now when you come down to verse 2, we're going to see the start of this next chapter in their story. God says, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now, therefore, arise, go over this Jordan, thou and all this people, unto the land which I do give to them, even to the children of Israel. First, God acknowledges the loss. He doesn't ignore it. He doesn't skip over it. He acknowledges Moses is gone. But then he says, now therefore arise. Go over this Jordan, thou and all this people. Something that I really want to highlight and I want you to notice is that God isn't speaking only to Joshua here. He's not talking to just the leader and telling him to do it. He's calling all of them, every single one. It was men, it was women, it was children. They are all called to rise. They all need to move forward together. And this is huge. This is something that you could easily miss if you were to just skim through this text. God is saying it's time to rise, and I want you all to do it together. Nobody stays behind. Everybody has a part to play. Everyone moves forward as one people. And you can almost picture it. Think about this scene in your mind. Here it is, hundreds of thousands of people. This is a whole nation standing together on the edge of the Jordan River. And they're uncertain about the things that are coming. They know what God has called them to do. And they have to take this step forward together. This is faith in action. This is seeing the trust in God as a community. God's asking them to be a part of something that's bigger than themselves. He's asking them to trust in Him, to be faithful, to obey His command. And with this calling, everyone has to respond. Everyone has to say, okay, we're being called to move. Where are we going? We're ready to follow God's lead. All right, what's the move? Everybody has to answer this call for themselves. And this is what makes it a community call, not just an individual one, because we're all called individually, but we're called to do it together as a group. When I think about how God had asked Israel to move together, they all had to rise and go together. All the people were to move. I can't help but to think, He's calling His church to do the same. We're all part of something that's bigger than ourselves. We all need to take the next step to wherever God is leading us, but we have to take the step together. Every one of us has a role to play. We're called to be faithful on our own, but we're called to move forward together. This is why it's so important to have strong believers around you, because we need people who are going to walk with us. We need people to support us and to encourage us every step of the way. And I can only imagine that during this time, when God calls them to move, this is how Israel, they leaned on each other during this time. They were learning to trust God as a people, as a whole, not just as individuals. But then the next part is, rising together is only the start. God is also saying to them, He says, you're going forward, you're going to take this next step, but you're going into something that you've never experienced before. This generation of Israelites, they had never known Egypt. They had never known slavery. All that they had ever known was the wilderness. If you go back and you'll see that God had said that the generation that left Egypt, they would all pass away before entering into the promised land. So this is the next generation. These are the people who were raised in the wilderness. The only people that were left from that older generation is Joshua and Caleb. Those are people that we'll read about in this. Everybody else, all they'd ever known was wandering through the desert and watching God provide for them. Their entire lives, they had been following God day by day. The pillar of fire at night, the pillar of cloud by day, they were following wherever it was that God was leading them. They had their food provided. All of their provisions were given to them. They had their manna from heaven. They had water coming from the rock. They knew that God was faithful. They got to see all of the miracles that had happened firsthand. But this is all that they had ever known. All they knew was the desert and, what God was giving to them. But now is the time where God says, it's time to rise. It's time to go over the Jordan. And another thing to mention, when God says, it's time, We're going to rise. You all need to rise together, and we're going over this Jordan. Something that we're going to see later on. I believe it's in chapter 3. We'll see that, the Bible mentions that during this time that it's talking about, the Jordan was in a flood stage. This wasn't just a kind of a little dried up creek that you could easily just kind of walk over and be done with it. This was a raging, rushing, it was muddy, it was dangerous. This was the barrier that they had set before them. If you were to think about this logically, it would make no sense to try to go across the Jordan. But God didn't say to them, he said, well, wait until the water goes down, wait until the season is over, and, maybe it's a little smaller, it's a little, quieter for you. That's not what God says to them at all. What he says to them is arise. And to them, the Jordan, it wasn't just a river. It was more than that. This is also a boundary for them. This is a line that is between everything that they had ever known and everything that God had planned for them. Crossing it meant to leave everything familiar behind, and they're now stepping into that unknown land. This is a land that they had only ever heard about. This is a land that was promised to the previous generation, but they didn't know exactly what the road ahead looked like. They didn't have all the details of what is going to be lying before them. The only thing that they knew is God said to rise and to go. And this is exactly what they did. But the thing is, this takes real faith on their part. It takes real faith to step ahead when you don't know what lies before you. But the important thing is even though they're stepping ahead into this unknown, they weren't going alone. Every single one of them stepped forward as a unified people. And this is how God calls them to be. This is how God calls us to be. This is how God works. He calls us to trust him, not just for ourselves, but together. He calls us to move as a community, to support one another, to encourage one another when the unknown that lies before us is scary. And you know what? For this group, for the Israelites who, were over in the desert, this is all that they had ever known. In order to reach the promised land that was set before them, they had to cross that river. They had to get into the water. They had to get their feet wet. They had to get messy, and they had to go through in order to receive the promise that God had for them. And when you think about this story, when you think about, what we're going to be covering, I think about us. I can't help but it just reminds me so much of us. And we're not going to be exactly, we're going to see some battles and things ahead and, some things that God had used them to do. We don't have those physical battles. We're not going to go out and fight anybody with swords or anything like that. So we're not exactly like it, but the principle applies. We're like this next generation of Israel. We are a church. We are a community. And as we look forward to this year, 2026, we get to feel that excitement. We're looking forward to what God has in store for us, what's next. But we also know that with a new year, with new things to come, that there's also a lot of uncertainty ahead. But we need to remember this. God is calling us to rise together. He's calling us to step forward as one people, unified. We don't know exactly what this year has in store for us. But the one thing that we do know is that we follow a God who goes before us. He leads us, he provides for us, and he calls us to do this together. This is the message that we have for today. I knew that we could only cover verses 1 and 2 because there is so much packed into this. This was just an introduction into this book of Joshua. And, I really think that this kind of sets the tone for what we're going to see as we continue on through this book. We're going to see a group of faithful people following God's lead as they journey through a place that is unknown to them. When I first started reading this, it just reminded me so much of us that, I'm really excited. I'm really looking forward to going through this book with you all. And with this being said, I hope and pray that since we know that this is where we're going to be, I believe there's, 24 chapters in this? I don't know. There's a lot of chapters in this. So as we know that this is what we're going to be covering for at least the next couple of months, what I want to say to you is please follow along with us. Make sure that you're doing your own personal study of this book. Because if you're reading on your own, you're doing some personal study at home, and then you're coming here and you're following along with the messages, it is going to make so much more sense to you, especially when we get down to some of the harder parts. I kind of already have a timeline for how this is going to lay it out. And, there's a couple chapters that we're going to kind of lump together and just talk about as a whole. So if you can, please follow along with us. We know that the book of Joshua is where we're going to be. So when you go home, if you've got nothing that you're studying right now, let this be the book that you study. I'm really excited to see how, in this book, we're going to see how God led the people of Israel. We're going to see how he's leading them into the promised land, into the things that, they don't know what lies ahead of them. They've got some battles, they've got some, difficult situations it would look like ahead of them, but then you get to see how God works through his people. We get to see this story of, how he used them then, but then we also get to learn and see how we can apply this to our own lives today. So as we come to a close for today, the invitation is pretty simple. If you've never put your faith and your trust in Jesus, today is your day. God is calling you to step into something that you've never experienced before. But I promise you, this one does not sound as scary as what we might see in this book. What he's calling you to step into is a life where you get to experience and you get to feel the love that he has for you. We just got out of the Advent season. We just celebrated Christmas. We got to see everything that we celebrated. He is calling you to step into a life where you get to experience the hope, the peace, the joy, everything that we just celebrated. This is the type of life that he is calling you to. When you step into that life, you are going to gain a friend. You are going to gain someone who will guide you, and he will always be with you. These things, when you think about it, they don't sound scary at all. This is something that, it's like a no-brainer. Why wouldn't you put your trust in him? So if you're somebody and you've never done that, let today be the day. Don't overthink it. Don't wait. Just say, Lord, I want to follow you. I'm ready to rise and I'm ready to step forward with you. And for those that you already know him, you already have your trust, you already have your faith in him, this is your chance where you can realign your heart. Maybe this past year, it had been messy. We just got through with a whole year. There's a lot of things that happened, a lot of changes that happened over this year. Maybe you drifted a little, or maybe, you've just been kind of standing still in your faith and you're kind of looking forward. This could be your moment to say, God, I know it's time to rise. I know that you're calling us to move forward. Lord, wherever you lead me, I will follow. As we go to step into this new year with all these new things that we get to experience, I'm excited about the new year because there's all these different things. We just got finished with the portion of the calendar, and we've got to see all these different events that we've got coming up that I'm just really excited and looking forward to it all. I hope that you feel the same way, and I hope that you have that same excitement. But as we look forward to it, we really need to make sure that we're letting God know, I'm ready. Wherever it is that I can help, wherever it is that he calls you to work and to lead of your own, I want to make sure that we're following him wherever it is that he leads us. We don't know exactly what's going to happen in this whole year, but we do know that God is leading us, and he's calling us to do it together. So let's make sure that we're taking these steps together and that we're going to trust him as we go into this new year. So whatever God has laid on your heart today, as we get a verse of invitation here in just a moment, this time is for you. Don't wait. Come today. Come and have that one-on-one time with just you and him. As we get a verse, this time is for you. We'll say goodbye to those online and hope you join us next week.